We're going to talk about the new WOPI protocol today, which I find really interesting. The WOPI protocol that makes the new Office Web App Server useful for once and extendable. And we're going to see how we can extend this. And this session and my interest for this protocol comes from the demands I got from clients that they need previews for other types of documents, not only Word and PowerPoint. Especially a couple of companies in the construction business. They have AutoCAD files, they have different of GPS-based XML files, etc. that they want previews on. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Wictor Wilén. I'm a Microsoft Certified Architect and Certified Master, an MVP. Works for Connecta in Sweden. You have my blog there. www.wictorwilén.se, where I try to blog as frequent as possible. My Twitter handle if you want to contact me, or my email. And of course, all the slides and everything will be on that site after this session, and all the code samples, etc. will be on Codeplex on a specific site there after this, so you can use it in your own custom projects. And I want you to take with you from this session how this WOPI protocol works and how you can build your own kind of editors and previews and viewers in SharePoint. Build your own sort of Office Web App Server, if you would like to say that, or WAC server. Because I think it can be really interesting, and it's a great partner opportunity as well. For instance, the big, let's say, anybody from Autodesk here, but they could build, they already have the web client to work with the AutoCAD files. So if they just implemented this protocol, we could have AutoCAD previews and views, etc. in SharePoint, in Exchange, and in Lync. So the agenda for today is that we're going to talk about WOPI, a lot about WOPI, and talk about the specification. And I'm going to walk through, it's not that hard specification actually, it's quite simple and pretty straightforward. We're going to walk through a couple of operations, how the WOPI client and servers communicate with each other in a secure manner. I'm going to introduce something called OpenWOPI, which is an open source WOPI client. We're going to build this, see how it works, based on MVC4, which I think is fantastically nice to work with MVC4 instead of traditional SharePoint web forms or ASP.NET web forms. We're going to talk about the discovery, how the WOPI server, that is SharePoint, Exchange, or Lync, discovers what kind of previews, etc. the WOPI client supports. And finally, we're going to look at some undocumented stuff in SharePoint 2013, how to do the real previews. You know that you can create your custom display templates in Search, previews, for instance. But how do you enable that in document libraries and everywhere in SharePoint? But a bit of history first. Let's take a look at Office Web Apps 2010. That was a service application in SharePoint, and only in SharePoint. There were one or more service applications in each farm. You couldn't customize it at all. Microsoft almost didn't do any updates to it compared to, for instance, SkyDrive and Docs.com, etc., which used a similar backend. But for the SharePoint, they didn't do that much updates. And thank God they rethought all this and made it into a new server called Office Web App Server. And they documented how this new server communicates with SharePoint, with the Exchange and Lync, and created this WOPI protocol. So it's a standalone server that can be shared across several SharePoint farms or Exchange servers and Lync servers, etc. SharePoint has the benefit, actually, which it can have subscribed to several different WOPI clients, whereas Exchange and Lync can only have one WOPI client connected. And it's based on the MS-WOPI protocol. And all these protocols, of course, are on MSD. And you get the link on the next slide. And WOPI stands for Web Application Open Platform Interface. And that's the short URL for the specifications. If someone don't want to go to SharePoint tonight and have some reading instead, that's very good reading. And it's almost fully documented, everything. It's been better now in the last couple of months, but at first you had to do real reverse engineering to sort this out, how it actually worked. And there's, as far as I know, I'm no licensing expert, but I don't think there's any licensing using this protocol. Shouldn't be. And it's a very much REST-like protocol, and it's OAuth similar or S2S similar kind of access or security mechanism in it all. But it's very basic and very straightforward. And it's based on a couple of principles. First of all, we have the discovery process. That is, we have a WOPI server, SharePoint for instance, how it discovers what kind of extensions or file formats does this WOPI client support. The WOPI client has to show to the server what features it supports. Then we have the WOPI client, that is, for instance, Office Web App Server or whatever we can build. Then we have the WOPI servers, which are SharePoint, Exchange, Lync, SkyDrive, etc. And you can also build your own WOPI servers. For instance, if you have building your custom ASP.NET or whatever kind of solution, you can integrate that with Office Web Apps, for instance. If you want Word or PDF previews in your custom solutions, that's not SharePoint or anything else, you can create your own WOPI server. And actually, last week, the Office developer blog published a blog post on how to do that, if you're interested. Then, of course, there has to be security. And we're going to discuss all these. We're going to discuss 3 of them. We're not focusing on the server today. So, the WOPI client. It has to provide a discovery endpoint. And that's very standardized in this protocol. It has to have, it's in an XML format. So it's an endpoint it provides with, and the server downloads this XML and parses it. And the WOPI client also can read files and folders and content and properties of files and folders from the WOPI servers. But it also can write back. So we don't, for instance, we can edit Word documents, and we can view at them and write back. So we can write back information to Exchange, Lync, or SharePoint, or whatever WOPI server we have. And the default Office WOPI client is, of course, Office Web Apps 2013. But we're going to build one now in a couple of minutes. I have a couple of slides here first and go through the basics before we go into some demo of it. Then we have the WOPI servers that we're not going to discuss today, but we're going to use SharePoint as a WOPI server. They read the discover endpoint and it registers the different file formats it supports. It responds to requests from the WOPI client. That is, a WOPI server never initiates the communication with the WOPI client. That's actually the end user that initiates that communication, which we will see in a couple of minutes. And SharePoint, Lync, Exchange, SkyDrive, etc. are WOPI servers or WOPI apps. So the first thing we're going to look at is the actual discovery process. How many of you have configured Office Web Apps with your 2013 farm, SharePoint farm, for instance? A couple of you. The first thing you do when you have set up your Office Web Apps farm is browse to that URL with the WAC server name /hosting/discovery, and you see a big chunk of XML. That's the first verification that it perhaps worked okay to install. So that's something you should always do. And one thing you notice that it's not protected by any security mechanism or anything. It's just an HTTP GET, anonymous. You can get in there and see what kind of file formats it supports. And this is an XML file you get. It's based on a couple of XML elements. First of all, we have 4 zones. We're going to discuss them in a minute. Then we have different applications, apps. Word, are, for instance, one, or PDF or Excel. Then each application can have actions. Actions are focused on a document extension or a prog ID. They have an action value. We can see here, edit, for instance. And then they have an URL source, which is the actual source URL of the WOPI client. Then there's something called a proof key. And this is actually the public key that the WOPI service will use to decrypt the messages, the security messages sent from the WOPI client. The proof key is, according to the specification, optional. But it's not true in the real world. So what we're going to build today is something I call OpenWOPI. And thanks to Sam Dolan or Pink Petrol for the awesome logo. And I've published on Codeplex. You can find it right now if you browse to it. And it's an ASP.NET MVC4 based WOPI client that currently supports a number of text formats. And hopefully, if I have time, I'll build more format support into it. But the idea is that you can take it and make something for your customers. Perhaps they have their own text formats or binary formats that you want to make previews or editors or viewers for. So what we're going to do is build, I've pre-built a lot of it because we don't have that long session. But we're going to take a look at some part of it, how to build it. And first off, let's take a look at this WOPI discovery thing. So if I switch over to my virtual machine here. Oh, no, I don't see it here. Let's do it like this then. Now we both see it. So here's a, let me close that down. Here's my Visual Studio solution for this, and I created 3 projects, basically 2 helper projects and 1 MVC4 project. And I defined a couple of controls and models in this one. And the most important thing is, first of all, how many of you have worked with MVC4 or MVC at all? A couple of you, and you really should learn that, because that's most likely how we're going to build SharePoint apps, or provider-hosted apps at least. And it's so much nicer than doing the traditional web forms. So for this, I created a hosting controller, which is very simple. Basically, all this it does is inspect other controllers or models in this view and look for specific attributes. For instance, I have a GPX controller here. Let's move that to the side. All controllers, I mark them with, first of all, an OpenWOPI app attribute that defines the app. Then we have actions on the different views down here, and we can define the different views. And my hosting controller will search through all the app domain for all these attributes and build up the actual discovery. So if we take a look at the view for this one, we have the discovery view, and this one creates this XML for us. And I published this one now as on my local IS machine here. And here it is. This is how WOPI discovery looks like. This is basically what you see if you browse to the same /hosting/discovery on your WAC server as well. But first of all, we have the zones here. In this one, I only configured 2 zones, but there are 4 available zones. The 2 internal, 2 external, and 1 for HTTP and 1 for HTTPS. And for this demo, I'm only using HTTP, but for any real-world scenarios, you should, of course, use HTTPS, as Chris talked about earlier. And I think that's something we all developers need to learn now, how to work with SSL, even in our development environments. I've seen in my current projects where we had developers not working in HTTP and move it to our test environments, etc. It's a lot of things that happen if you're not prepared if you haven't worked with SSL or HTTPS in your development environments. But forget about that right now. In my zones here, I have apps, and the first one I call GPX, and I have a couple of attributes. Check license is not interesting in our scenario here. Basically, this is, if you look at the specification, you see it's built upon 2 things primarily. Of course, Word or the Office applications, and you need an Office license, and of course, OneNote. A lot of the operations are based on OneNote, working with folders, etc. So, but I have check license false on everything here. Each application can have its own fav icon for that specific application. Then we have a number of actions. And the first one here is called view, and it has an URL source here. And I also append a couple of parameters here. These 2 are the 2 most common parameters that you use, and the WOPI server will pass in the current UI language and the data language. So, for instance, if you have localized your WOPI client, you can get the user interface in the correct language, etc. Each application can have one default action. That is, if you click on it in the document library, click on that link, you get the default action. And every application can also have 1 or more extensions. And in this case, it's the GPX files, and I have the view and embed view and the interactive preview modes. And you see they point at different views in my MVC4 applications here. The first one is the real view. When you click on the document, you get a full screen view. The other ones are for the display templates or the search preview panels. I made a similar one for Visio here. It's not, it actually isn't that good right now. It only extracts the thumbnail from the Visio file and show that thumbnail. So if someone have more time, they can make a full-blown Visio client, because Visio preview, because that's what I want. That's the kind of document I most work with. Then I have the proof key down here, and this is actually my public key that I tell the WOPI server, use this public key to decrypt the access tokens I will send you. So for this demo, we're going to create a text viewer, a text editor. So first of all, we're going to create, I have some cheating here, of course. We're going to create a model for my text documents and add a new class here. And we call it text app. Well, everyone can see this? Nobody said no, so let's import that one. Oh, sorry. And all my models should be deriving from something I called OpenWOPI. Did I do wrong? No? Let me check on this one. OpenWOPI model, yeah. Oh, it's just the reference. Sorry. I made this so it should be far easier to implement these operations. And they return a document, all the models. And we're not looking at the implementation detail just, but we have to have this model in place to build the rest of it. Just resolve the references here. So now I have a model. We're going to go back to this one in a bit. Then I have to create a controller, so I can put in these attributes. Add new controller. Delete. Add controller. Text app controller. And of course I have some attributes here to drag in. So I tell my client here that this is an OpenWOPI app for text file, call it text. And I also add a view to this one and remove the default view here and resolve these references. So if we just compile this one, I just compile it. Oh, sorry. One more thing. Why doesn't this one? Sorry. Of course, we have an overload here. OpenWOPI controller. Now it should work. So once I built this, we can go back to the discovery endpoint and reload that one, and we should have this text application here as well, as you can see. And what we have to do now is go to the SharePoint server, and let me see where is that SharePoint server, and read-register the WOPI bindings. Let me remove the old ones that I have, and add new SP-WOPI binding, and I specify the server name, the fully qualified domain name of my server, and in this case I use allow HTTP because we're not using HTTPS here. That will take a couple of seconds, and our site, and it should be registered by now. If you're working with this or adding or removing bindings, normally it takes just a second or two for them to work in SharePoint, but sometimes I have actually been needed to do an IS reset to get it to work, but in 99% of the cases it takes 10 or 15 seconds. So if we jump back to our IS server here, that one, and go to a site, load that one. You also have to reload the user interface once it's done, because there's a lot of JavaScript involved in making all these previews working. Working on it. And we go to our document library. And then I have a GPX file here. And you can see there's no previews here yet, even though I specified previews as one of the actions in the app. But there's no previews yet. But if I click on this one, I get to the default action, and it will render my GPX file as I specified in the controller, or the view. Please let me have internet access. Yes, I do. So this is GPX file that I downloaded from Endomondo, where I've been out running. So I get that track here. But this is exactly what one of my customers asked for. They have GPX files for different buildings they are building, etc. And they want to have previews of that. So here it is. Also, we can look at the Visio one. It's really blurry, but that's the preview. The thumbnail extracted from the Open Packaging Convention VSDX file. But there's still no previews here, and we're going to add that later. But if we click on our test file here now, we get an error because we haven't created the view for our model yet. And before we do that, let's go back to the slides. Come on. Minimize that one. Extend. Beautiful. Slideshow frog. So let's take a look at how the communication are between the client server and the end user. There's a lot of iframes in SharePoint 2013, first of all. Iframes are the new black. So everything is iframes, and the WOPI server is no exception, or WOPI servers and clients. First of all, the WOPI server generates an access token for that user and file, and a specific unique ID for the file that they want a preview or a specific view of. Then it generates an iframe, and with that also in the URL specifying the ID and access token. Normally it's a GET request according to the specification, but SharePoint actually uses a POST request here, but it works as well. And one of the reasons for this is now the WOPI server presents a nice user-friendly URL. The WOPI Client URL is very long and involves a lot of encoded characters, etc. So it's not that user-friendly. But the WOPI server can implement the user-friendly URL here. For instance, you have in SharePoint, you just add the question mark web equals 1 to get the default view. Then the WOPI client calls back into the WOPI server or into SharePoint or Exchange or Lync using a GET request and passing in this access token that has been passed and the ID of the file, the unique ID of that file. And it gets back metadata. This is not an optional, this is not a required step, it's optional, but most likely you want some metadata, you want the name of the file, if it's locked or not, etc., or other characteristics of the file. Then the WOPI client does another GET request, passes in the access token and ID again, and retrieves the content of the file, and parses it and renders it in the right iframe. So it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's always the WOPI client that initiates the request to the server, and it's actually the end user that initiates the request to the WOPI client, since it's an iframe. Then you can do other operations like posting back if you update the contents, or you can lock a file. You can even access a secure store from a WOPI client if you want to. And there are 4 basic request types that must be implemented by a WOPI server. But we're building a client here, so we can choose which operations we want to use. But a WOPI server must implement this, and this is according to the specifications, of course. The first one is to do file-level operations. That is, get metadata of a file, lock a file, etc. And then you have an URL, something with WOPI, something else, then /files / the unique ID of that file. In SharePoint, for instance, it's wopi.ashx /files and the ID. Then we have to get the contents of a file, you just append /contents. Then we have the similar thing for folders, if you want the properties of a folder and the children of a folder. And these two latest are specifically, if you can read the specification, you see that's made for OneNote. You know, OneNote is made of folders. But of course, there are several other file formats that use the folder structure as well. Then we have a lot of HTTP headers that are sent back and forward. First of all, you must have an authorization header, and that is this access token, so you can authorize with the WOPI server. Because you are not allowed to have any authentication on your WOPI client. It cannot be use NTLM or Kerberos or whatever. You are not allowed to. It has to be anonymous. And same thing is with these WOPI endpoints. Then there's a lot of MAE headers that can be sent, client version and server version. There's a correlation ID, there's a client machine name for debugging purposes. And then there is also this XWOPI proof and the proof old. We're going to talk about it in a couple of seconds. So access tokens, I mentioned it a couple of times. And it's a server that generates the access token, passing it to the client, and the client uses that for every request. An access token is passed in the authorization header, and it should expire. You also have an access token time to live passed in each request as well. And the interesting thing with this is that the WOPI client doesn't have to understand it. It's just a chunk of text it has to pass back with every request. It's up to the server to detect if it's modified, etc., or what's in it. And if you use some reflector on SharePoint, you will see there's some information about the user and the file in that access token as well. And it's very important that you scope it to a specific user set of resources, so you can't reuse, so the WOPI client or someone can't reuse that access token to access other files. Then we have the file or folder ID that must be unique because you don't pass the full URL back to the WOPI server. The WOPI server sends the client via the iframe unique ID for that file. And so the WOPI server have to keep track of the file ID and whatever URL it's on. And both these token ID and are passed to that URL source that we saw in the discovery XML. So if we take a look at the security pieces here, the WOPI client implements security through this proof key. We saw the public key in the discovery XML, and the server uses that to decrypt the proof key sent in the HTTP header to validate that this is a valid request, it's coming from the correct machine and the correct server, etc. And it's not required according to the specification. And actually, the specification says that if you send the proof key in the discovery XML, then the server has to use that one. But if you don't pass it in there, the server shouldn't care about that. But actually, SharePoint does care about that. It actually requires that there is a proof key, which is, of course, is good. We shouldn't have unsecure WOPI clients that don't have this validation. And we actually have two proofs, the old proof and the new proof, or the current proof. For instance, if you update some information or you think that someone stolen your private proof key, you can generate a new one, and during a short period of time you can have an old and new one, so you don't have that much downtime, etc. So let's take a look at how we send these requests back and forward and how to generate this proof key, and take a look at the format of this proof key as well. So let's duplicate my screen again. And there we are. And for this, I created a utility class based on using the web client, and created an own implementation of the web client here that actually passes the access token in the correct way all the time. And this is what the APIs use under the hood in my OpenWOPI implementation here. So when I create a new instance of this one, I have to pass in the URL, the access token as a string, and the time to live as a string, and the proof key. And we use that to generate the correct URLs to the WOPI server and send the correct headers. So if you take a look at this one, for every request, I'm appending to the URL the access token and the time to live. That has to be appended to every request back to the WOPI server. And that I don't do anything with it. I just take the access token, time to live that I received from the WOPI server and send it on every request. Then we had a couple of headers. First of all, the authorization header. And it has to be, if you work with OAuth, you find it very similar. You have, this is a bearer token. You add a bearer, then a space character, and then the actual proof key here. And in this case, I take the access, no, not the proof key, the access token, sorry. The access token, and pass in there. So it passes both in the URL and as the header. Then I add the two other headers, XWOPI proof and proof old. And here I take and assign data using my private proof key. And what I sign here actually wasn't in the specification from the beginning, but it is now. So we'll jump into that one. And this is a set of bytes. First of all, the length of the address, I think it's first. No, the access token and the access token encoded, and then the length of the URL and the URL, and the length of the current ticks at the moment and the current ticks. And this is actually what SharePoint looks at. If it doesn't find any XWOPI proof in the header, it will throw an error, access denied, I think it is. And it actually goes in and looks into this key, extracts it using the public proof key, and goes in and see if the URL matches what's in this proof key. You can look into that on a rainy day even more. Then I add a couple of other things which are good for debugging. The timestamp should be there. That's not a requirement. But I also add a client version and the current machine name. For instance, if we have a farm of several machines, it's good to know which machine it is. And SharePoint actually logs all of this in the ULS log, so it's very easy to track. So if we go back to the proof key. In my case here, I store the proof key in a simple configuration file here, and I have a method in there that generates the private key and the public key. So it's just a method to create new keys for each and every machine. Any questions so far? Everyone is really tired today? Or just want to party? So that was sending requests. So before we send a couple of requests, let's take a look at these actions and the file operations. I already talked about actions that are scoped to an app, and the URL source that they specify, which is the actual URL that the iframe is pointed to. And they can have an extension or a prog ID. So what kind of file level operations can we do? First of all, we looked at this /file/ID. Here I can also send a couple of actions. I can check file info, which is a normal one. If you do a GET request, you check the file info. You get back a JSON result with different properties of the file. Then you can upload new files. You can lock and unlock, that is check in, check out. You can delete files. Then you have the COBOL stuff, execute cell storage. I don't think I ever will implement that in this one, but that's what SharePoint Office uses to just send the deltas back and forth instead of sending the whole file. Then we have something called restricted links as well. That's what's used in 365, for instance, when you share an anonymous link or share externally a link with a document. So you can actually send a link to a document, and so people can view it in the WOPI client without having access to the actual file. Then we have the get content stuff. There's two operations. It's get file or a post file, a put file. So it posts back of the full data. So we go back to the code that I showed you previously, where we did just copy in a couple of a code snippet and see what that code actually does. So if we go back to the text app controller, what I do here first is I create the default view. This is when we view a document. When you click on it, first of all, I create this text app model. It's a model for text files. And I create a view from this model and use a view document here. So if we go into that one, what it actually does is create a new text document. This one is just a base class containing a number of properties of the file. Then we have a couple of methods on that one. First of all, the check file info. And if you look at the code, I've specified for many of these the actual entry in the specification if you want to verify if I've written it correctly. So what this check file info does is create a URL based on this source that's sent in. And then I send this using the OpenWOPI client. And the source here is actually what we saw, the wopi.ashx/files/id. And I just do download string and get the string back, and that's it, JSON result. And I use the JavaScript serializer to read out the number of properties of this document. For instance, the breadcrumb folder URL, so I can browse back to the document library folder where the document is located. I can get out if web editing is enabled or disabled, download URL, if it supports locks, that is, I can lock the file or not. And there's a lot of these properties in here. If we go back to this next one, let's check file info. I need the info about the file. Then I just get the file. It's a very similar method. I use the OpenWOPI web client again, but I append /contents to the URL, so I get the actual file. And then I download the data. In this case, it's only a text file, so what I have to do is, in the view, I just output the text data. So if we go back to this one and add a view to it, to the controller, default view, add view, let's call it view, and remove all of that and drag in that one. This is how my view looks like. I have a MVC master page up here. Then and I insert the info bar, that's the thing I have on the top. I have a menu. And I'll tell this view to use this OpenWOPI text document as a model for this page. And I'll just render out the content of that model down here. But before we do that, let's add a couple of more options. I think we have the preview and view. Let's add that to the controller as well. Text app. So we have the preview. See, it's very similar to what we had before, but we have action values are interactive and embed view in this case. And they're using the exact same thing. And let's create a view for that one. Preview. OK. Remove that and add the preview. Since I now added two more actions to this to the discovery XML, we have to go back to the SharePoint to remove and re-add the bindings. I could actually go in and add a specific action at one time, but in this case it's faster to do this and then this. So hopefully in a few seconds we should be able to see if the preview works. Of course, previewing or viewing a text file in SharePoint works by default by clicking on it. But it's not that exciting in this case, but we can do more things that we'll see in the next demo here. Come on. So let's go back here and reload my SP Evo 13 site. Once that one is loaded, I'm going to see if we have a preview of the text files. Hopefully, if we click on that one, yeah, we get a nice preview of it here. So that's how we do. What happened now under the hoods, if we can actually go back to the SharePoint machine here. Because I set up the ULS viewer to filter on all the WOPI events. I thought I did that. Quick filter, show and category. And the ULS or SharePoint logs everything that happens with the WOPI protocol. And as you can see here, we don't have to read all of that. But that's the URL sent back to SharePoint, and that's not very user-friendly. But that's what's happened in the iframe or when the WOPI client talks back to SharePoint. And we can see here's a couple of things. You see they get the request for check file. That's the first thing that happens. Let's see if we can find more. Then it doesn't find the XWOPI proof old. It tries with that one first to decrypt the token, and it uses the XWOPI proof second the other time. And a bit further down, we have the get file when we get the actual content of the file. And since I also included the machine name here, it's really easy to track which server are causing problems. And if you're building WOPI stuff, you should really look into this to ULS viewer on the SharePoint box. And also you can use the correlation ID sent from SharePoint to, or from the WOPI server to the WOPI client. So you can have the same correlation ID on your own WOPI client and WOPI server if you want to trace records, trace the errors, etc. So now we have a viewer at least for this one. We still don't have any previewer. There's still no preview, even though we have this embed view and interactive preview, because SharePoint doesn't understand that by default. So let's take a look at a couple of more slides before we do the next, before we implement editing in this one. And first of all, the action values. There's tons of action values. I think it's about 20 of them or something like that. But SharePoint only uses view, edit, mobile view, and interactive preview. The rest of them are made for, as you can see here, we have a couple of % action values, and that's used for PowerPoint broadcasting with Lync, for instance. There are a couple of interesting that I don't know what they will do, but I have my own thoughts about that. The SharePoint team might do something interesting with them, like form submit and form edit. And there's a couple of new ones in the March PU as well that's not documented in the specification at all. But hopefully they have big ideas about that. But there's a lot of these actions in there. And view is, of course, the normal viewing. Edit is edit mode. Mobile view if you have a mobile device. And interactive preview is the flyout in search or in document libraries. Okay, so let's build the update thing, and for that we just add a new action to our controller that we have here, and we add the edit action. And I specify here as an edit action, and what that one does is actually just rendering a different view. It doesn't do any editing. So I have to implement a method that this view when it handles the post back. So I have a save view here, and so this view here will actually render just in text area instead of writing out the content, and so the text is in the text area, and then I have a form on that view that posts back into this save action, which uses the put file to put the data back into SharePoint. So we have to implement a view for this edit one. Add view, edit, add. Remove that and add that one. So here I create a new form, add 2 hidden fields for the access token and the access token time to live, and generate a text area for the content. So if we do that and go back to the SharePoint server and redo the bindings and add the bindings again, we will soon have edit mode of this file. It's not my application that's slow, that's SharePoint. So, if we're really lucky, it should work. We could reload this one. And should soon have, yeah. And if we click on test, we have the edit button. We can edit this, write something, save. Let's see if we click on it again here. So we edit that one. So, fantastic. Text file is most likely not the most exciting files to edit, but I see a huge opportunity for, as I said in the beginning, for ISVs to create for their own file formats here. But the next thing is to get these previews to work, because that's actually where this idea started. We wanted previews, and we don't want to edit. Of course, if we can edit AutoCAD files, it will be fine, but it's a preview that's interesting. Instead of opening a download for AutoCAD, for instance, you have to download the file and then see if that's file or not. So to do that, I have to go back to the slides to show you some stuff. And we talked about this one, how we add the WOPI binding to get the normal view and edit to work. But it doesn't generate any previews for us. And we have two kinds of previews. We have the one in the search center that's based on display template, and then we have the ones shown in document libraries. And although they are based on display templates, they are not executed in the same way. So for document libraries, we actually have to go into an undocumented territory. It's more of a coincidence that I found out how it worked. So first of all, I didn't plan on having it in the session, but since we found that out, we can take a look at that one as well. But before that, I mentioned it earlier that SharePoint are the only server that I know of right now that supports several WOPI clients. So if you want to integrate your custom thing into Exchange or Lync, you have to choose either use the WAC server or your custom one, or implement some proxy in your custom one to go to the WAC server. And in Exchange, it's a simple PowerShell commandlet to execute, and in Lync, you use a topology builder to connect it to the WOPI client. So how do we get these previews then? Oh, I shouldn't extend in my VM. Sorry about that. So we'll take a look at two scenarios. First of all, how we customize the search experience, and then how we do it in document libraries. So if we go to the Search Center here, hopefully that loads. It's a bit slow sometimes. And if we search up our text document, test1.txt, and we will not have any previews yet. Come on. So if you hover this one, we don't have any preview. And this is a very simple technique. We just use the web interface to fix that preview. And how many of you have installed the March PU for the WAC server in their forms? None of you? How many running 2013? If I start with that. Make sure you're on PU March, because then you get the previews of PDF as well. Or viewing of PDF files. You don't get the previews. But to get the previews, you use the same technique that I will do right now here. So we go into Site Settings. We go down to the Search Query Rules. No, sorry. Not Query Rules. Result Types. And I want this to look like a Word document, basically, with the previews. So I find the Word document somewhere. Word. The Word display template, and I make a copy of that one. And let's call it WOPI. and choose to ignore that one and choose when we have file extension equals to txt, gpx. I can add whatever I want here. And then use the Word item template in this case. I can, of course, create my own display template for use for this specific, but in this case, I just use the same as Word do. We click Save. Yes. And hopefully, this will work. Didn't work. What? Yeah. That worked well. Yeah, now it's working. Should work now. Got the correct icon there. At least you can see we have the edit here. I think it's just too small now, right? But we have the edit button there, so we can go in and edit it, because we discovered that from the WOPI binding. But something went wrong still. Why? Ah, now it's working. But this is a known problem with the WAC server. Never mind that. Normally just click open in the document and go back, and it should work again. Not. Come on, work. Yes, please. Search, I want to show this. Oh, trust me, it should work. Yeah. That's how, that happens with Office Web App Server as well. So that's a known issue. But the cool thing here is that we actually get the edit links and everything that the WOPI client supports in this case. And the same for the GPX files. I could get that to preview there as well. So, but let's go back to this one. I want previews here. And to do that, we actually have to do, first of all, I'm going to say, none of this works in Office 365. It's on-premise only, which is good. But we have to do some SharePoint coding in this case, and deploy a farm solution, or it could be a sandbox solution, but a farm solution to enable previews in document libraries. And to do that, let's jump on over to my SharePoint box. And here I created a simple full trust solution with the farm feature. And this farm feature will actually deploy a control, a delegate control, to the additional page head to insert some JavaScript into every page in all sites. And it's a fairly straightforward JavaScript control. There's a couple of JavaScript objects in SharePoint by default. One is called File Preview Manager, and one is called Embedded WAC Preview. We just have to add our own extensions to this one. TXT, GPX, and VSDX in this case. And tell them which formats do I support, first of all, and then the size of the preview windows. Once I deploy this, and of course, before doing this, I must make sure that the file preview.js file is loaded, because that's where these objects are created. So when I deploy this one to the farm, we should fairly soon be able to see previews in document libraries. This is very static at the moment. I'm thinking about the way to making it more dynamic, whatever kind of extensions we add to the WOPI client. So let's jump back here. Yeah, it would be cool if it could work. Or generate this in JavaScript in some way, yeah. So just reload this one. Now I deploy the farm solution, so we had to recycle the app pool. So that's why it takes a bit. And you can't do this with an app. Come on. So let's see if it worked. Let's hover this one. If I have internet connection, we have the preview in here. And we have the text files as well in Visios. So that's really cool, actually. And no, not the VM. So I think that was it. Let me see. I'm almost on time. To summarize this is an open protocol. The protocol is quite easy to understand. It's not that many operations. It's based on HTTP and a REST-like syntax. And as you've seen, you can quite easily create your own. You don't have to make this advanced MVC stuff that I made with attributes and everything. If you want a simple controller, it's very easy to build. I have a couple of blog posts about making it in a simpler way on my blog. And please do come with suggestions for other file formats that you would like to support in this kind of way, so we can build a really cool OpenWOPI client or server for that matter as well. So thank you, everyone, and you will find the slides and everything and links on that short URL or on my blog later this evening or tomorrow, depending on how much beer there is tonight. So thank you, everyone.